Welcome to Crisis in Perception, understanding the world as a connected whole where we unravel the systems, stories, and power structures that shape our world, one book at a time.
Today we're doing a deep dive into the really extraordinary life and career of Major General Smedley Butler.
He's a two-time Medal of Honor recipient known as the Fighting Hell Devil Marine. But this isn't just a biography.
No, not at all. We're using his story, his 33 years in the Marines, as a lens to understand the real mechanics of American empire.
And specifically how private capital, we're talking bankers, corporations, how they were really the ones directing U.S. foreign policy and military force.
Exactly. And it all builds to this central, unavoidable question.
Yeah.
How did this man, this ideal American soldier, come to the conclusion that he was, in his own words, just a racketeer for capitalism?
That's the core of it. So let's start with the moment that really crystallizes that conclusion. The scene is Newtown Square, Pennsylvania in 1933.
Right. Butler's retired. He's living in this converted farmhouse.
And his home is just filled with the souvenirs of his career. You've got swords, command flags, all his medals.
And these two, giant red satin umbrellas from his time in China. It's the home of America's most decorated Marine.
And into this scene rolls a chauffeured Packard.
A Packard, yeah. And out gets a man named Gerald C. McGuire. He's a bond salesman, but he's not just there to sell bonds.
No. He's an emissary. He represents some of the most powerful financial interests in the country.
We're talking people connected to J.P. Morgan, the DuPonts, the big corporate law firms Sullivan and Cromwell, and they are absolutely furious with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
It's not just a political disagreement either. This is, for them, an existential threat.
It's all about economics. Roosevelt had just taken the U.S. dollar off the gold standard.
And the New Deal, with all its regulations, to them, that was an assault on capitalism itself.
Yeah, one of the DuPonts literally called it socialistic doctrine. Yeah, remember the context here is the depths of the Depression. There's real fear of radical change in the air.
So McGuire sits down with Butler and lays out this chilling proposition.
He wants Butler to lead a private army.
An army of veterans. They figured they could get 500,000 guys from the American Legion.
And Butler's job would be to publicly denounce FDR, to sort of manufacture a national crisis, claiming the president was destroying the country with his socialism.
The end game being a coup d'etat, the infamous business plot.
It wasn't a plan for the violent overthrow on the streets. It was more subtle, a pressure campaign.
The idea was to force Roosevelt's hand, to make him appoint a new cabinet position, a Secretary of General Affairs.
Which is just a euphemism for a dictator.
Right, someone who would hold all the real executive power, and FDR would just be a figurehead, like the King of Italy.
And that comparison is so important because McGuire had just been touring Europe. He'd been to fascist Italy. He'd been to Nazi Germany right after the Reichstag fire. He was actively looking for a model.
And this is the moment. This is where everything clicks for Butler. McGuire is flashing these thick bank books, promising to pay off his mortgage, fund his life.
But Butler just shuts him down immediately.
His response is just incredible. He tells McGuire, "My one hobby is maintaining a democracy."
He doesn't just refuse, he makes a counter threat. He says if they try anything like fascism, he'll raise his own army of 500,000 vets and, quote, lick the hell out of you.
He was ready to fight a civil war to stop them.
It's this incredible moment of clarity for him. And a year later, he gives that famous quote that really sums up this entire deep dive.
"I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism."
That's our mission today. To trace those 33 years and see the evidence that proves that confession is true.
Yep.
How the ideal of democracy was constantly at war with the reality of empire.
So let's go back to the beginning, the birth of that empire in the Spanish-American War. Okay, so Butler starts his career in 1898. He's 19, a Quaker, of all things, who leaves school because he genuinely believes he's going to Cuba to fight Spanish tyranny.
Yeah, his idealism is just palpable. He gets posted to Camp McKellar at Guantanamo Bay. And his first night is terrifying.
But not because of combat.
No, not at all. It's the mosquitoes, the isolation, and the realization that disease is the real killer. 7 times more U.S. troops died from things like typhoid and malaria than from Spanish bullets.
And that idealism he felt was, well, it was completely disconnected from the actual reasons for the war.
Completely. The book makes it clear that this was driven by expansionists like Teddy Roosevelt, sure, but also by big business interests who saw a clear path to profit.
There's that quote from Senator John Thurston, who just says it outright. War will increase stock values, and every certificate that represented a share of an American business enterprise would be worth more money.
I mean, you can't be more explicit than that. It was an investment opportunity, sold to the public as a crusade for freedom.
And the moment the war is over, the U.S. moves to secure that investment. Cuba doesn't get independence.
No, it gets the Platt Amendment, a document that was forced into the new Cuban Constitution.
And it basically gave the U.S. the right to intervene with its military whenever it felt its interests were threatened.
Which, in practice, meant life, property, and individual liberty was code for corporate assets.
So this opens the floodgates for American corporations. J.P. Morgan, United Fruit Company.
Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm. They basically took over Cuba's key industries: sugar, tobacco, the utilities. And the Marines at Guantanamo, where Butler started, they became the permanent enforcement squad for this corporate takeover.
And you see that in action in 1912. There's an uprising by Black Cuban War veterans.
These are men who had fought for Cuban independence for years, and now they're just asking for the equal rights they were promised.
But their protest threatened the stability needed for the sugar harvest.
Right, it threatened profits. So the Marines were sent in to crush them. The whole thing just turned Cuban independence into this deep, lasting humiliation.
From there, the focus shifts almost immediately to the Pacific, to the Philippines.
Which the U.S. had just acquired from Spain. And this move was driven by a kind of elite panic back home.
You're talking about the frontier thesis.
Exactly. The idea from historian Frederick Jackson Turner that American capitalism and democracy needed a constantly expanding frontier, new land, new resources to extract.
And in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau declared the domestic frontier officially closed.
So the elites started looking overseas. And the Philippines, with its 7,000 islands and its strategic position on the route to China, looked like the perfect new frontier.
But those islands were already home to millions of people who were fighting for their own independence, so the U.S. needed a legal workaround.
They needed a way to rule the Philippines as a colony without giving its people the rights of U.S. citizens.
And they found it in one of the darkest corners of American legal history, the Insular Cases of 1901.
It's so important to connect this to what was happening domestically. The Supreme Court that decided these cases was largely the same one that upheld segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson.
So what did they rule exactly?
They ruled that these new territories were foreign to the United States in a domestic sense, inhabited by alien races who weren't protected by the Constitution.
So you get two Americas, one where the Bill of Rights applies and another the colonies where it doesn't.
It was the legal framework for empire. It allowed the U.S. to conquer and extract without the inconvenience of granting democracy or citizenship.
And the military strategy on the ground quickly started to reflect that dehumanization. The initial talk of benevolent assimilation gave way to something much uglier.
Much uglier. They brought in generals who had experience fighting Native American tribes, and they used the same tactics: concentration camps, devastation of crops, harassment.
And this is where the corporate mandate becomes so painfully clear.
It's astonishing. U.S. commanders on the ground wanted to destroy the hemp supply to starve out the Filipino resistance.
A standard counterinsurgency tactic.
Right. But they were overruled by Washington and Wall Street because the export value of that hemp was too high. The profit motive literally came before the lives of American soldiers.
Which all culminates in the Samar Campaign. General Jacob Smith gives his infamous order to turn the island into a howling wilderness.
An order carried out by men like Littleton Waller, who Butler would later serve under. The brutality was just. It was a direct import from the Indian Wars.
And the trauma of that is symbolized by the theft of the Balangiga bells, which is still a wound for the Filipino people today. Butler is learning the playbook of empire, step by step. #tag $B diplomacy in Central America, 1903-1914.
So the next phase of this really centers on building the infrastructure for a global empire. And number one on the list was the Panama Canal.
Right, the dream of naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan. A shortcut between the oceans was essential for a global network of bases.
But the land belonged to Colombia, and the Colombian Senate refused to ratify the treaty that would give the U.S. control.
So private capital stepped in to engineer a solution.
It was a full-blown conspiracy, really. French investors who owned the rights to a failed canal project, they teamed up with a powerful U.S. law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell.
Led by William Nelson Cromwell, they basically decided if Colombia wouldn't play ball, they would just create A new country that would.
And that's exactly what they did. They backed a small independence movement in Panama, and right on cue, a U.S. warship, the Nashville, shows up to make sure Colombia can't interfere.
And just like that, the U.S. has a client state and a canal zone, and who gets sent to guard it?
Smedley Butler, of course. And he gets a front-row seat to the arrogance of U.S. control.
The Cocoa Grove riot in 1912.
Yeah, a clash between U.S. troops and Panamanian police and civilians. The Americans just acted like they owned the place because in their minds, they did.
There's a quote from a Panamanian newspaper at the time that just nails it. It says, Americans feel superior, that it's inherent in their race in any race of conquerors.
And afterward, the U.S. actually demanded Panama pay an indemnity. They punished the Panamanians for resisting their own occupation. It was a lesson in power.
This whole model of using military threats to secure financial control gets a formal name under Secretary of State Philander Knox.
Power diplomacy.
Right. And it was sold as a more enlightened form of foreign policy. The idea was that economic forces, not just military ones, would create true stability.
It was supposed to be bankers, not Marines, running the show. But of course, the Marines were always on call to back up the bankers.
So how did it work mechanically?
It was a very clear formula. U.S. banks, like J.P. Morgan and Guarantee Trust, would give huge loans to a struggling Central American country.
But there were strings attached.
Big strings. The country had to accept American financial advisors. And these guys didn't just give advice. They took over the customs houses.
And customs duties were the main source of government revenue.
Exactly. So they would divert all that money to pay back the American bankers first, before the local government saw a penny. It was basically receivership. It held these nations in a state of permanent debt and dependency.
This is the system that creates the so-called banana republics.
A term coined by the writer O. Henry. In Honduras, for example, Marines invaded again and again to protect the interests of U.S. fruit companies, like United Fruit. It was a perfect blend of weak democracy and total U.S. market control.
And the whole system comes to a head in Nicaragua in 1912.
Right, it collapses. There's a drought, disputes over the loans, and massive popular anger against the U.S.-backed President Adolfo Diaz.
A revolution breaks out, led by General Benjamin Zeledin, and the U.S. can't afford to let its puppet fall.
So they send in the Marines, including Butler, and Butler's attitude is just dripping with the casual racism of the empire. He calls the rebels spigs and dismisses their cause as hot air.
It's that same tactic again. Label your opponents as something less than human to justify whatever you're about to do to them.
And what they did to Zeledin was brutal. After he was captured and killed at the Battle of Coyotepe, they put his body on a horse and paraded it through local towns.
A warning.
A gruesome warning. And watching that body being paraded through his village of Niquinohomo was a 17-year-old kid named Augusto Cesar Sandino.
Wow.
Sandino later wrote about that moment, seeing Zeledin killed by bullets of Yankee soldiers serving the interests of Wall Street. That singular act of imperial cruelty created one of America's most determined enemies.
And the blowback from that intervention lasted for decades.
Decades. It led directly to the U.S. backing the Somoza family dictatorship, which used the U.S.-trained National Guard as its personal terror squad for 40 years. It's a perfect example of how these interventions never really end.
So this all builds to what you could call the peak of these interventions, which happened in the Caribbean under President Woodrow Wilson.
Which is deeply ironic because Wilson ran as an anti-imperialist.
Right. But in 1915, he orders the invasion and occupation of Haiti. The official reason was to restore order after some political chaos.
But the real driver, as always, was financial. The pretext was paper thin. A few months before the invasion, U.S. interests, specifically Citibank, had already sent Marines in to literally steal $500,000 in gold from the Haitian National Bank.
So the invasion was to secure the investment they had just stolen.
Pretty much. The Wilson administration wanted a new treaty that would give the U.S. formal control over Haiti's finances. They needed the military to act as Citibank's collection agency.
And the treaty they forced on Haiti had one particularly controversial clause.
The land clause. It was the most explosive part of the whole thing. It allowed foreigners to own land in Haiti for the first time.
And you have to understand, for Haitians, this was a betrayal of their entire history.
It was. After their successful slave revolution in 1803, they established the principle that the land of Haiti belonged to Haitians. Land ownership was independence.
And this clause reversed that. It opened the door for American corporations to come in and buy up the best agricultural land.
It was an attempt to reimpose a colonial economic structure. And Butler was sent in to lead the ground forces to enforce it.
under his old commander from the Philippines, Littleton Waller.
And here, Butler starts to pioneer what we would now call counterinsurgency, or Korean. He's mixing military force with psychological tactics, trying to win hearts and minds by turning villagers against the Kako rebels.
But his attitude is still incredibly paternalistic. He sees Haitians as our wards, children who need American guidance.
Yeah, but it wasn't soft power. It was brutal. In 1915, he leads this bloody hand-to-hand assault on the Kako stronghold at Fort Riviere. It was a 10-minute massacre in the dark.
And for that action, he received his second Medal of Honor.
And this is where a future president enters the story. A young Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time.
FDR was a huge supporter of the occupation. He even bragged later that he wrote Haiti's new constitution himself.
And he used the occupation to benefit his friends. Butler reinstituted this system of forced labor called the corvée.
Which was basically slavery.
It was unpaid gang labor, a practice from French colonial times. And Butler's new U.S.-trained police force used these forced laborers to do work for U.S. corporations, including for the heir to the Tabasco hot sauce fortune, who was a friend of FDR's.
The brutality of the occupation inevitably led to more resistance. A Haitian officer named Charlemagne Perrault led a major new rebellion.
Perrault became a national hero, but in 1919, he was assassinated by Marines. And what they did next was pure psychological warfare.
They took a photograph of his body, stripped and tied to a door in a pose that deliberately evoked the crucifixion, and they distributed it all over the country to terrorize the population.
But it backfired. It just made him a martyr. The real legacy of the U.S. occupation was creating a client army, the Garde d'Haïti, designed not to defend the country, but to suppress its own people. It set the stage for decades of dictatorship and instability.
And it was a similar story right next door in the Dominican Republic.
Almost an identical playbook. The U.S. invaded in 1916. Again, the pretext was stability, but the goal was financial control. J.P. Morgan's bank already controlled the customs revenue.
And the occupation there created another long-lasting problem.
It created the dictator, Rafael Trujillo. The Marines trained and equipped the new National Army, and Trujillo, one of its officers, used that very army to seize power and establish one of the most brutal dictatorships of the 20th century, a dictatorship that the U.S. supported for decades.
Okay, so we follow Butler's path across the globe. Now let's zoom out a bit and really analyze the system itself. When you look at all these interventions together, a clear pattern emerges.
That's undeniable. You see the same names popping up over and over again. J.P. Morgan, Guaranty Trust, Sullivan and Cromwell, United Fruit, Standard Oil.
Right. And the pretexts for invasion always sound noble, protecting democracy, ensuring stability, but the actual objective on the ground is always economic.
Always. It's about seizing control of customs, or protecting a hemp supply, or forcing a country to allow foreign land ownership, or securing oil fields.
This is what Butler meant when he called himself a high-class muscle man. The U.S. military was the collection agency for Wall Street.
If a government didn't play ball, or if a popular movement threatened corporate assets, you'd send in the Marines to renegotiate the terms.
The invasion of Veracruz, Mexico in 1914 is a perfect case study.
A perfect one.
Yeah.
The official reason was this minor incident where some U.S. sailors were briefly detained in Tampico.
But the real story was about oil.
It was entirely about oil. President Wilson wanted to install a government in Mexico that would be friendly to U.S. oil companies like Texaco and Standard Oil, who were competing with a big British rival. The flag incident was just a convenient excuse.
And Butler's role in this was very direct. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a spy.
He went in beforehand, undercover, posing as a civilian, and he mapped the entire city for the invasion force. He identified the key defensive points.
And the invasion was a slaughter. Butler got a Medal of Honor for it, but he later admitted they were mostly fighting untrained civilians and teenage boys.
A tragic incident for a minor pretext, all to secure an advantage in the oil market.
And then you flash forward to his very last command in China in the late 1920s. And what's he doing?
He's literally guarding the Standard Oil compound in Tianjin. I mean, it's the perfect bookend to his career. His final job was acting as a private security guard for Big Oil.
A key part of making this whole racket work was the culture, the language of empire.
Yes, the way resistance was systematically reframed.
Whether it was Filipino nationalists, Haitian Caicos, or Nicaraguan liberals, They were never called patriots or freedom fighters.
Never. They were always bandits, criminals, savages. And that's not just casual racism. It's a deliberate political tactic.
Because if you label them as criminals, they're outside the laws of war.
Exactly. You can justify torture, summary executions, parading corpses, all the things you couldn't do to a legitimate enemy soldier. And that language evolves over time. Bandit becomes subversive, which then becomes terrorist.
And for the racket to continue, you have to ensure that people back home don't know the ugly details. You need a kind of manufactured amnesia.
And that's a great way to put it. Think about the way Butler's own anti-war book, War is a Racket, was basically buried for decades by the Marine Corps. They didn't want that story told.
It's about controlling the narrative. It allows the cycle to repeat without public opposition.
And that cycle of exploitation inevitably creates what we now call blowback. These interventions don't lead to stability. They plant the seeds for future conflicts.
We saw it with Sandino in Nicaragua, with the instability in Haiti. But the book draws a line to something much more contemporary, the rise of the modern Mexican drug cartels.
It's a shocking connection, but it's a clear chain of events.
How does that work? How do you get from dollar diplomacy to the cartels?
It's about U.S. policy in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
During the Iran-Contra era, the U.S. was obsessed with fighting communism in Central America and the Caribbean.
So they cracked down on the traditional drug smuggling routes through that region?
Right, they effectively shut them down. But the demand for drugs in the U.S. didn't go away, so the supply chain had to shift.
It was forced to move north through Mexico.
Exactly. And that shift suddenly poured billions of dollars and huge logistical power into the hands of Mexican organized crime figures who, until then, had been relatively small players. U.S. policy, aimed at a short-term geopolitical goal, inadvertently created the super cartels that destabilize the region today. It's the ultimate example of blowback.
So this gets us to maybe the most fascinating part of the story. How does Smedley Butler, a man who executed this racket so effectively for 3 decades, break free from it?
It's not a single event. It's a slow, painful erosion of his faith in the system. And it really starts around 1914 with that invasion of Veracruz.
The Medal of Honor he received for...
He was horrified by it. He knew it was a lie. He tried to give it back. He told his mother he couldn't think of a single thing he did that warranted it.
He felt the medal was just a way to gild over the ugly truth of the operation, which was the killing of civilians.
That's the first major crack in his worldview. He's being rewarded for something he knows was morally wrong. His internal compass is starting to spin.
The next big blow comes during World War I. He desperately wants to see combat in Europe, but he misses it.
He ends up running this massive camp in France, Camp Pontoise. And there, he's not seeing glorious battle, he's seeing the industrial-scale horror of modern war.
The endless trains of fresh troops going to the front and the mangled survivors coming back, the shell shock.
He saw that this wasn't a noble crusade. It was just a brutal fight between greedy empires over colonial spoils. He started to see the connection between the little wars he fought in the Caribbean and this global meat grinder.
After the war, he tries to apply his military mindset to a domestic problem. He becomes the police chief of Philadelphia in 1924.
Right, he's hired by reformers to clean up the city during Prohibition. And he goes in with his full imperial toolkit.
He calls the bootleggers bandits, the same word he used for insurgents in Nicaragua. He says a cop who shoots a bandit is just like a soldier shooting an enemy.
He's literally importing the tactics and the language of empire onto American streets.
But it's a total failure. The corrupt political machine is too powerful, and they force him out.
And that failure is a moment of profound realization for him. He said it led him to understand he'd been fighting the wrong gangsters all along. The real gangsters weren't the guys running speakeasies. They were the powerful politicians and financiers running the whole show.
His last overseas tour in China just deepens his cynicism. He successfully protects the Standard Oil plant, but he knows he's just a glorified security guard, and he can see that a war with Japan is coming.
And then comes his retirement and the final breaks with the establishment. First, he kills any chance he has of becoming Commandant of the Marine Corps with the Mussolini scandal.
He tells a story in a public speech about Mussolini running over a child in his car. It causes this huge international incident, and his career is officially over.
Which frees him up politically. And that leads to the defining moment of his transformation, his support for the Bonus Army in 1932.
These were destitute World War I veterans, many of whom served with him, who marched on Washington to demand the bonus payments they had been promised.
And Butler becomes their champion. He's not the Marine general anymore. He's on their side. He sleeps in their Hooverville camp. He gives this incredible speech telling them they are patriots, not tramps.
His speech convinces thousands of them to stay and continue their protest, which leads to the infamous Battle of Washington.
It's just a horrifying scene. President Hoover orders the army to disperse them, and General Douglas MacArthur, with his aide Dwight Eisenhower, leads tanks and cavalry against their own unarmed veterans and their families. They burn the camp to the ground.
The irony is just staggering. MacArthur and Eisenhower, the future heroes of World War II, attacking American citizens.
While Butler, the man who had spent his life imposing America's will abroad, stands with the protesters. For him, this was the moment the empire came home. He was seeing the same military force he used on Haitians and Nicaraguans now being used against his own comrades.
And that's it. The break is complete. In 1935, he lays it all out in the magazine Common Sense.
It's an absolutely searing confession. He says he helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. And he delivers that final, devastating summary of his entire career.
I was a racketeer for capitalism.
So we come full circle, back to the business plot. Butler goes to Congress with this story, but the media, for the most part, just dismisses it.
Right. J.P. Morgan's people called it perfect moonshine. But the congressional committee that investigated actually found his story credible.
They quietly stated that they had verified all the pertinent statements made by General Butler. And if you look at the background of the man behind the plot, Grayson Mallet Prevost Murphy.
McGuire's boss.
Right. His career is like a shadow version of Butler's. He was involved in military intelligence in the Philippines in 1902. He was part of the Panama Conspiracy in 1903. He was a senior VP at Guaranty Trust.
The same bank that ran the Dominican Republic.
He had the exact combination of military, intelligence, and financial experience to plan an operation like this. He knew how the machinery of regime change worked because he'd helped build it.
So what Butler realized in that moment was that the very same tactics he had used to subvert democracy abroad,
Overthrowing presidents, shutting down assemblies at gunpoint.
were now being aimed at the heart of American democracy itself.
It's a terrifying thought. And it brings to mind that quote from the philosopher Frantz Fanon. What is fascism but colonialism in the heart of a traditionally colonialist country?
The tools of empire were being brought home to be used on Americans when Wall Street felt its power was threatened.
And Butler took all this outrage and poured it into his little book, War is a Racket. It's his passionate argument that the only way to prevent future wars is to take the profit out of war.
It's an idea that directly paves the way for what another general, Dwight Eisenhower, would later warn about.
The military-industrial complex. Butler laid the intellectual groundwork for that critique decades earlier. His work forces you to see the American project not just as a story of spreading liberty, but as a system of economic extraction backed by military force.
And the legacy of that system is still with us. The Panama that Butler once guarded is now a global hub for the kind of offshore shadow finance that dollar diplomacy helped create.
And the cycle of intervention and blowback continues. You see it in the instability in Mexico, which is directly linked to past U.S. policies. The moral of Butler's story is that you can't understand the world's current problems without confronting this messier, more violent, profit-driven history.
And you have to accept that the tactics of empire don't just stay overseas.
That's the final provocative thought. The great danger today is the temptation to apply the strategies of foreign counterinsurgency here at home. When you start branding your own fellow citizens as terrorists or subversives to place them outside the law.
Yeah, you're using the empire's playbook.
You are perpetuating the very cycle of violence that Smedley Butler spent the last years of his life trying to expose.
Thanks for joining Crisis in Perception. If you'd like a shorter visual breakdown of this book, you can find the mini explainer version linked below. And if this episode helped deepen your understanding of the world as a connected whole, consider exploring our other book analyses.